Welcome to the Data Exchange Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Lorica. We're having a special holiday episode where we'll go over the books, the nonfiction books we covered on our newsletter during the course of 2025. So, whether you're going on a long haul flight or you're just looking for a gift to give to a friend or a family member or something to read for yourself during this break, I hope you enjoy at least some of the titles that I'm about to cover. And if you want links to the individual titles, go to the episode notes, which you can find on the dataexchange.media. So let's get started. First book is The Thinking Machines, Jensen Huang, Nvidia, and the World's Most Coveted Microchip. So we all know, of course, that Nvidia is the most valuable company in the world, and it's become famous, especially in recent years, because of its central role in AI, particularly the training and deployment of AI models. And this book goes through all of that, but actually, to me, the most interesting thing is the early days when Nvidia was just one of many, many startups trying to duke it out in the graphics marketplace. And there were other well-funded startups that were on paper equally likely to succeed as Nvidia. So you really kind of get an appreciation for how far Nvidia has come along. And of course, what makes this book interesting now is with the release of Gemini 3, Google's tensor processing units, the TPUs, are also gaining prominence. So let's see how all of this plays out. The second book is Lionel Barber's biography of Masayoshi Son called Gambling Man, The Secret Story of the World's Greatest Disruptor. This book came out in January, and honestly, I think it kind of flew under the radar, maybe because it came out early in the year, which is a shame because Masayoshi Son is arguably one of the most interesting, if not the most interesting figure in the history of tech investing, right? So we tend to caricature him based on WeWork, what happened on WeWork, and of course, the dot-com bubble crash. But this biography reminds us that he really has a career that spanned the modern technology industry, right? So it starts out in the PC era and then all the way to today, where he's still kind of a player, given that SoftBank owns ARM, for example. One of my favorite parts of the book is basically the coverage of Japanese corporate culture, as well as the plight of the Korean community in early post-war Japan. So I can't recommend this book enough. The third book is called Apple in China, The Capture of the World's Greatest Company. I learned more about modern manufacturing in this book, I think, particularly in the high-tech sector, than in anything I've come across. And we often hear politicians talk about, bringing back manufacturing operations back to the U.S. And this book, frankly, explains why that is a logistical fantasy. And the scale of the integration is really hard to comprehend until you read this book. So Apple didn't just hire workers, they trained 28 million people, a number larger than the entire workforce of California. So the result is a manufacturing ecosystem that they created in China that is so specialized and so efficient that replicating it elsewhere will be very difficult. So read this book and learn more about modern manufacturing than in any other source. The fourth book is called The House of Huawei, The Secret History of China's Most Powerful Company. So, fun fact, I actually did some consulting work for Huawei about a decade ago. This was during the early days of big data technologies like Hadoop and Spark. And my biggest takeaway from that time was really the culture being so incredibly hierarchical. Yet, at the same time, I have to say I was consistently impressed by their ability to execute in the field. And Eva's book really captures that history and that culture, which I guess they call wolf culture, through a series of seminal events in the company. Now, Huawei is particularly interesting today because it's really the company that is producing the best chips and the best silicon in China. Um, and the Chinese government is encouraging many of these Chinese foundation model producers to use Huawei chips and link them together. So millions of Huawei chips to produce systems that potentially could rival any single US supercluster. The fifth book on our list is Every Screen on the Planet, The War Over TikTok. And I come across people from ByteDance, the company behind TikTok, in many tech conferences because they gave talks about their tech stack, particularly at Ray Summit and events like that. And so I kind of know at some level of detail what they do on the technology side. But this book really explains the culture of the company as well as the inner workings or the arc of how TikTok became TikTok because wasn't clear from the beginning that it would blow up, right? So, and of course, the book devotes quite a bit of time on TikTok's famed recommendation engines, and it's actually quite eye-opening because we often assume that TikTok's algorithm is this pure mystical AI, but actually, this book reveals that they actually rely on this notion of what they call heating, which is manual intervention by the staff to force virality and to train the model. So anyway, given TikTok's importance, not just in the media landscape, but also geopolitically, definitely check out this book. Book number 6, which marks the halfway point of our list, is Breakneck, Dan Wang's book on China. I know this book has been making the rounds of pretty much every podcast there is, so I will keep it brief. But the core thesis here is the distinction between China as an engineering state run by technocrats and obsessed with manufacturing, construction, and building things, and the US, which is a lawyerly society obsessed with procedure. Anyway, I'm sure you've heard of this book, so if you haven't picked it up, make sure you do. Number 7 is The Hour of the Predator, encounters with the autocrats and tech billionaires taking over the world. I honestly found this to be one of the best explainers of the current state of global politics. And it's also a very short and breezy read, very engaging, very entertaining. It's hard to put down. So the core idea is that politics is now dominated by an alliance of autocrats, tech billionaires, and private fixers who are very comfortable operating outside the old rules. And the author is a former advisor to a previous prime minister of Italy, as well as to Emmanuel Macron. And he has a funny line in here, which I will like to, let me see if I can recall it. So he breaks down modern governance with a ratio along these lines. Politics is 10% the West Wing, 20% House of Cards, and 70% Veep. The eighth book that we want to recommend is Andrew Ross Sorkin's 1929 Inside the Greatest Crash in Wall Street History. And again, this is one of these books where the author has been making the rounds of just about every major podcast. But what I will say about this book is that it is a gripping read. So if you're thinking that this will be one of these dry, historical, heavily footnoted books, it is not, right? So it reads like a dramatic thriller with a lot of really interesting characters. So frankly, it reads like a ready-made for a screenplay. It's that good and that gripping. And obviously, it's topical because there's a lot of talk about an AI bubble these days, and we're definitely in a bubble. But obviously, calling when the bubble is about to burst is going to be a difficult thing to do. And also, the financial architecture is markedly different from 1929. Anyway, if you're looking for a book to give someone who might be interested in learning about finance, I think you can't go wrong with this one. The next book we want to recommend is The Genius Myth, A Curious History of a Dangerous Idea, written by Helen Lewis, who writes for the Atlantic magazine. So she walks through the history of IQ tests and some of these early genius studies. And you very quickly see how these supposedly objective measures were used to justify race and gender hierarchies. It really makes you think about how we use proxies like test scores or those puzzles that people use when they during job interviews. And it's actually quite relevant for our sector because in tech, we tend to kind of celebrate the lone genius, right? So as if luck or teamwork or having a healthy team around you doesn't matter. But bottom line is this is a well-researched book that really will get you to think about some of these supposed objective measures. The 10th nonfiction book on our list is The Invention of Design, a 20th Century History. So remember a few years ago, I'm not exactly sure how many years ago, but there was a period a few years ago when the phrase design thinking was all over the place, right? So it came out of IDEO, but somehow kind of escaped to broader, wider usage beyond the community of designers. So this book is actually an excellent post-mortem on that era. And she moves through kind of the notion that design can be used to tackle wicked problems, really, really hard problems like inequality or bad infrastructure. But what really landed for me is the author's argument that a lot of those projects didn't fail because the designers were bad, but because the problems were fundamentally beyond design. So they involved politics, for example. So the takeaway is that, there's no substitute for policy, coalition building, or, real accountability. So pick up this book, read through it, and relive the era of design thinking. The 11th book on our list is Dirtbag Billionaire, How Yvon Chouinard Built Patagonia. So I'm a big Patagonia fan. I've read a couple of Chouinard's books, and I have to say this is no hagiography. So the author really shows Chouinard as a brilliant but somewhat of a contradictory figure. Um, it doesn't shy away from its difficult management style. So, he's known for disappearing on trips and expeditions for months, and then he returns and criticizes employees, who, to be fair, were actually keeping the company afloat while he was gone having fun. Um, but with all that said, I have to say, despite exposing all the flaws of Yvonne, I am still a huge fan of the company and what it stands for after reading this book. So read it, Dirtbag Billionaire and the Story of Patagonia. The final book on our list is John and Paul, A Love Story and Songs. I'm a big consumer of music documentaries. I constantly scour Netflix, HBO, Amazon Prime for the latest music documentaries. With that said, I wasn't actually planning to read, let alone recommend a book about the Beatles. But this one really surprised me. So it's a psychological deep dive in many ways into one of the most productive and creative partnerships in history. So as you read this book, you'll find yourself reaching for whatever music streaming service you have, in my case, Apple Music, and listening to the song that is being described in that passage or chapter. Um, so the book really dismantles that myth, right? So where John was supposed to be the cool rebel and Paul was the boring commercial part of the partnership. But it really opens up the partnership between uh, Lennon and McCartney, and you learn a lot about how many of these classic Beatles songs were created. So there you have it, 12 nonfiction books for the 12 days of Christmas. I'm a little hesitant to designate what the best books of these 12 are, given that I highly recommend all of them. But if I were to uh, tease out two books, which I think might be a little bit below the radar, I would first, I would say, call out uh, The Hour of the Predator, number one. So check that out. It's a quick read. And number two, I think Lionel Barber's biography of Masa Son, which I think, like I said earlier, flew below the radar. So there you have it. That's our episode, and I hope you enjoyed the list. And like I said, go to the episode notes on the dataexchange.media, where you can find links to all of these titles. And also go to our newsletter, the gradientflow.substack.com, where I have short reviews of each of these books in the most recent newsletter. And I'll be back next week, and we will do this all over again.